Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Teaching the Book Thief, a professional development webinar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center and the Philosophy Learning and Teaching Organization and the University of Washington's Center for Philosophy for Children. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs at the National Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, let me introduce our sponsors. First of all, I'd like to tell you a little bit about America in Class from the National Humanities Center. That is the brand under which the Humanities Center promotes all of its programs for high school teachers of American history and literature. The center itself is an institute for advanced study located in Research Triangle Park. It is the country's only independent institute in the humanities for all, independent institute of advanced study in all branches of the humanities. And when I said Research Triangle Park, I meant Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. We provide fellowships to scholars from all over the world who come to the center to research and write in subjects like history, literature and language, philosophy, criticism of the arts. We also operate an extensive outreach program to teachers with these webinars and a wide variety of online teaching resources in American history and literature. And you can find everything that we offer for teachers at americainclass.org. We have two co-sponsors tonight. First is Plato, the Philosophy Learning and Teaching Organization, which is a national organization devoted to developing a network of people engaged in K-12 philosophy. It provides education for K-12 teachers about ways to introduce philosophy into their classrooms, and it supports teachers, faculty, and graduate students working in the field of pre-collegiate philosophy. It advocates both philosophical and educational communities for more pre-collegiate philosophy instruction. You can find a great deal more about Plato by going to its website, plato-philosophy.org. And once you get interested, you may want to attend the next Plato conference at the University of Washington at Seattle, June 29th and 30th, 2015. And you can find information about that conference on the Plato website. In connection with that, we want to also recognize the University of Washington Center for Philosophy for Children. It offers a resource-rich website, departments, depts.washington.edu/NW Center/. There you'll find information about free summer workshops for teachers, a newsletter. The Center for Philosophy of Children runs the Washington State High School Ethics Bowl, provides 3 fellowships for graduate students, and also runs a program called Philosophers in the Schools in the Seattle Public Schools. So if you're interested in introducing philosophy into your classes, these 2 resources are the place to go, and we really urge you to take a look at them. You'll find a lot of rich material there that will help you deepen and enrich the humanities courses that you teach to your students with some philosophical perspectives. Now, at the end of our seminar this evening, you can go to the Book Thief website, and there you'll find a recording of the program, and you'll also find our PowerPoint. You can feel free to plunder that PowerPoint, take it into your classrooms, use the material you see there. You will also find an evaluation. Please fill that out and send it back to us. Once we receive your evaluation, you'll be able to download a certificate of completion, and you'll be able to take that to your local certifying authority to get whatever recertification your participation in this program warrants. Now, how do you participate? Well, throughout the program, our seminar leader is going to be stopping to ask questions, and we hope that you will then respond by typing in your answers through the chat. Put your cursor in that green box that I have bracketed there. You'll find that at the lower left hand of your screen. Type your response, hit that send box to the right, and your message will appear in the large chat box above. I will be bringing the chat into the conversation at appropriate moments throughout the evening, and we really do hope you'll participate. Don't just wait for us to ask questions. Don't feel free to ask your own questions or make comments. Give us feedback on how you teach this material. If you see some material that you think would be particularly usable in class, let us know how you present it. And if you see a potential project or an assignment, something like that, share it with us. Our webinars are better. They're more engaging if you participate. So the more you participate, the better the webinar. So please feel free to send us your comments and questions. Don't wait for us to ask a question. Well, let me now introduce our seminar leader tonight. Jana Mohr is the director of the University of Washington Center for Philosophy for Children. In 2012, she published The Philosophical Child, and in that same year, she co-edited Philosophy in Education, Introducing Philosophy to Young People. She is the president of the Philosophy Learning and Teaching Organization and is the chair of the American Philosophical Association's Committee on Pre-Collegiate Instruction in Philosophy. She is also the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Questions, Philosophy for Young People. So let me unmute Jana's microphone. And Jana, tell us, what philosophical issues does the book thief raise?
Well, hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be with everyone this evening. And I'm assuming as we go along here that all of you have read the book Thief, that many of you teach it. And so I'm not going to talk very much about the plot of the book Thief. As you all know, the book Thief explores many philosophical issues, and we will only touch on a few of them tonight. The book addresses the meaning of courage, the nature of friendship, moral obligations connected to being part of a community, and the beauty and ugliness of human life. And so we're going to consider these topics somewhat briefly, given the time we have, within the structure of what I call a community of philosophical inquiry. And how that's defined is it's a structured and collaborative exploration. And by collaborative, I mean that it is not run by me as the facilitator, but it really explores topics that emerge from all of us, from the conversations that we will have. And it's aimed at constructing meaning and acquiring understanding through looking at philosophical topics. I thought I would start, though, by just a few words about philosophy in general, because in the United States, philosophy is not generally taught in pre-college schools. Many teachers and others are unfamiliar with philosophy, and it can be somewhat intimidating. I think it has a reputation often as an ivory tower subject that belongs in the academy and is inaccessible to most people. But I actually think of philosophy as something we do quite naturally. When we ask what's the right thing to do in a situation, when we wonder if something is fair, we're engaging in philosophical thinking. The word philosophy comes from the Greek, which is often translated as love of wisdom. And so in ancient times, philosophy was understood as the search for wisdom. Well, the question about what wisdom is another big philosophical question, but at least I would think it means addressing and thinking about in deep and thoughtful ways the big questions that surround the human condition and our lives. And so philosophy explores questions that can come up in the most ordinary situations. So if a student is having a problem with a friend, for example, philosophical inquiry can help us think about questions like, what makes someone a friend? What are the obligations of friendship? What does it mean to say that someone is a good friend? What kind of responsibility does that place on the people involved? And so philosophy, I think, is something that students do quite naturally. I actually began being involved in this work when my children were quite young, and my oldest son, who was 4, was asking questions like, are colors real? Which I recognized as philosophical. So I think of philosophy as all about questions. And one of the reasons that I think philosophical inquiry is so valuable in schools is that questions are often not a central part of how we teach young students. All of the research shows that over 95% of questions that are asked in a classroom come from teachers. And it's pretty rare for student, at least in my experience, for student questions to be driving the content of the classroom experience. But asking questions and learning how to have confidence in your questions and to develop skill in asking good questions is a crucial skill for our students to develop. And philosophy is a wonderful subject for helping students to cultivate these skills because the questions we explore have been asked for thousands of years, and there are no one right answers to these questions, right? They wouldn't be philosophical if they were settled. So questions like what is beauty, what is a good life, what is justice, those are questions that we will continue to explore probably for the rest of the human condition, and that our students can enter into without feeling like there's some knowledge that they're supposed to have and don't, or that there's some answer that they're supposed to get right. Students often say to me that one of the reasons they really like philosophy sessions is they feel like it's a space to explore ideas and questions where they don't feel like they can get it wrong. So, why introduce philosophy in pre-college schools? As I say here, I think the question really should be, why not do so? Because I think that exploring philosophical questions is something, as I say, children naturally do, and providing them a space in which to do that with their peers has a number of positive consequences. One of them, as I've already alluded to, is a confidence and skill in asking questions. Another, which is often associated with philosophy, is the development of critical thinking skills, analytic reasoning. When we engage in philosophical discussion, we're really making claims and having to provide reasons for these claims about why we think about certain questions in the ways that we do. But the other things that philosophy in a classroom, the other consequence is that students develop what I think of as perspectivism. That is, that they see that questions like what makes a good life are questions that you can approach in many different ways, and that there are multiple perspectives and ways of seeing the world that start to emerge in these classroom discussions, and students start to understand that they can disagree with someone else without one of them being right and one of them being wrong, that often there are multiple truths to some of these questions that are deepened by all of our voices being engaged in the conversation. And finally, I think one of the reasons to encourage students to continue to think about philosophical questions is that it's important to keep wondering about the world. And I think often children start to lose that affinity for wondering when they get to maybe age 12, 13, 14 and start worrying about more how they're perceived. But if they can keep wondering about these big questions, I think that really enlarges and enhances their lives. Okay, so what's a community of philosophical inquiry? I'm just going to give you some basic elements of what we're going to be doing here and what I hope you will try out with your students. So as I said in the beginning, the community of philosophical inquiry involves an engagement in an inquiry that aims at constructing meaning, that functions in a collaborative way, and that seeks to acquire understanding through the examination of philosophical questions that are of interest to the participants. So, for example, when you read The Book Thief with your students, you might come up to a passage like some of the ones we'll explore this evening, and you can ask the students, so what questions does this make you wonder about? What issues does this bring to your mind? And those questions that come from the students can start to form the beginning of philosophical inquiry. Connected with that, there's an acceptance in a community of philosophical inquiry of what historically philosophers have called epistemological modesty, which just means basically an acknowledgement. Epistemological is kind of related to what we know about the world. So it's an acknowledgement that all of us, including the teacher, are fallible and that our views could end up being mistaken. And so related to that, the teacher then demonstrates a reticence about advocating our views, and we model a comfort with uncertainty, with there not being any final and agreed upon answers to most of the questions being explored, that some of these questions are going to continue to be uncertain, that we can make progress in our thinking about them, but we're probably not going to definitively answer a question such as, what is beauty? The community also has to foster an intellectually safe environment because it's crucial that every child, every student's voice be heard in the group. And so the group has to both examine the questions that emerge from the group and listen to what each other have to say, connect what each student says to what other students have said, and appreciate that there are many ways to understand the world, and that having as many contributions in the conversation as possible enhances its value. And then the community helps its members develop what I think of as philosophical dispositions, such as the propensity to ask questions and search for assumptions, a commitment to seek and evaluate reasons. I taught a fourth grade class today, and we were talking about the nature of home, and one of the students made a claim about what home is and was asked why, and said, well, it's just because that's what it is. And another student said, that's not a reason. So we really want to help the students to understand what it means to give reasons and to evaluate reasons. Intellectual humility, honesty, and carefulness, a dedication to searching for truth through inquiry, independence of mind, and a critical consciousness about information and sources of knowledge. One of the things we want our students to take away from philosophical inquiry is the ability to look at what is being told to them, what they are reading online and elsewhere, and ask questions about it. Don't assume that because a so-called expert has told them it or they've read it in a book that it must be true. Okay, so in the webinar, I'm hoping that we'll enhance our awareness of the philosophical suggestiveness of literature, to see the ways in which a book like The Book Thief sets forth many possibilities for inspiring philosophical conversation, and develop some basic tools for spotting when there are philosophical topics that might be discussed and facilitating conversations about them. And I hope we will engage in this kind of community within the chat, so that then when you go back to your classrooms, you've already had the experience, if you haven't already, of having this kind of philosophical group conversation.
Jana, if I may interject here, we have a participant who, in her post to the chat here, underscores everything you just said. Pat Marshall writes, those kind of questions, philosophical questions, make excellent focus questions for quarter exams. I use those with some of my classes and build the readings around them. And she goes on, many students respond better to online blogging in a password-protected environment when first engaging these kinds of questions, because they give them time to think before speaking. I gather that's the sort of thing you hear all the time, right?
Yes, and the other thing, actually, I'm really glad you raised that, because the other thing that's really helpful, I find, an online forum is really useful. The other thing that I do often is have the students have philosophy journals. And so in our conversations, there'll be spaces for them to write questions, to do some reflections. And so many students who are maybe more reticent about participating in a large group discussion have a space in which both to think a little bit before they do, and also to offer some thoughts without necessarily participating always in the group. It's also, as I'm sure all of the teachers know, it's also really useful to do some small group work. I also make use often of a silent discussion mechanism where I give the students poster boards, and they're able to communicate with a small group about some of the questions that are raised by a piece of literature in writing and without speaking at all. So thanks for raising that. I think that's really helpful.
Jana, let me invite our participants to share with us in the chat any techniques they use along these same lines, and tell us whether or not they take this kind of philosophical approach to their teaching. But let me ask you this. Do you find that this approach works well with a wide range of students, you know, regular students, honor students, AP students, or is it more the province of AP kids?
No, actually, I find that it works differently with different students, but we are in classrooms of kids who are really struggling in school, and who are in classrooms for learners who are having a particularly challenging time, through classrooms of, you know, students who are accelerated learners. And often it's the students who maybe are more disengaged from school, who often I find come alive in philosophy sessions. And I think part of that is this topic that I talked about earlier, that they feel like they're not going to get it wrong. And they are able to think out loud in ways that are maybe freer and more open than they feel is possible in some of the more traditional areas of school. So,
Okay, well, great. Well, let me reiterate.
Go ahead.
Let me reiterate the invitation to our participants. Tell us if you use this sort of philosophical approach in your classes, and if so, how. But shall we forge ahead into The Book Thief?
Great. Okay, so as you all know, The Book Thief takes place in Nazi Germany. The narrator is deaf, and the novel's central character, who is the book thief, Liesel, is a child who's living in a town near Munich with her foster parents. And the book really shows the ways in which small choices in a small place made by ordinary people can be of great ethical weight. So the first topic that I want to address is the meaning of courage. And Richard, would you mind reading the first passage?
Sure. When he appeared inside, Mama fixed her gaze on him, but no words were exchanged. She didn't admonish him at all, which, as you know, was highly unusual. Perhaps she decided he was injured enough, having been labeled a coward by his only son. For a while he remained silently at the table after the eating was finished. Was he really a coward, as his son had so brutally pointed out? Certainly in World War I he considered himself one. He attributed his survival to it. But then, is there cowardice in the acknowledgement of fear? Is there cowardice in being glad you had lived?
So Hans's son calls him a coward because Hans refuses to support Hitler, because Hans refuses to take on this sort of nationalistic battle that Hitler is leading and is getting his citizens engaged in. Is this cowardice? Is it cowardice to refuse that you are against, that you feel is wrong? Why does Hans's son use the word coward here when he is angry at Hans? It's sort of an unusual, in some ways, an unusual word to use in this context. Hans implies that he believes he was a coward in World War I because he was afraid to die. So is that cowardice?
You know, you're right. It is an unusual word in this sense because the easy thing to do, given the context here, would be to go along with Hitler, to join the Nazi Party. That is an unusual insult that his son hurls at him. And if we could go back just for a moment to your earlier comments about philosophical teaching and to my question about how applicable is it to all ranges, Pat Marshall writes, I teach AP and freshman reading enrichment. Both groups participate in this sort of discussion once they feel comfortable with their in-class peers. Okay, so come back to our question. How do you respond to this passage and toward discussion questions? Hans' son calls him a coward because Hans refused to support Hitler. Is this cowardice?
And most often students will say, well, it's not cowardice to, disagree with something you don't believe in, right? To refuse to go along with something because you don't believe in it. But maybe he was a coward in World War I when he was afraid to die. And so we'll talk about, so what is courage? What's the relationship between courage and fear? Can you be courageous and still be afraid?
Yeah, we have an interesting comment here. In the chat, I've partnered this passage with Charge of the Light Brigade to polarize the viewpoint, help the kids see the spectrum of courage, cowardice, and infuses how that infuses the issue of duty. They often get to the idea that we cannot be courageous without being afraid. And Amelia Philbrook writes, I think his son uses the word coward because he sees what Hitler is doing as the leap that has to be made, the leap of faith that you have to be brave for. Very good point. Very good point.
Yeah, right.
Jana, how would you respond to that?
I think that's right. I think, because his son sees bravery as being engaged in this battle. as just, going along with it and fighting for what the country is trying to do. And his father's refusal to do that then is a refusal to make that leap, so to speak. But I also think that's interesting what Pat says, that the students often get to the idea that we cannot be courageous without being afraid, because I do find students will often say, when we talk about, well, so what is it to be courageous? And they'll say, well, it's doing something that you're afraid to do, that you're intimidated by or afraid of. And so then we talk about, well, then can you actually be courageous if you're not afraid? Is it possible to be courageous without being afraid? If courage has to do with sort of, facing your fears or doing something despite being afraid.
These same themes would come up in another book I suspect a lot of our teachers teach, The Red Badge of Courage.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to move us to the next passage. And Richard, would you read this one as well?
I can no longer join, Hans stated. The man was shocked. Why not? Hans looked at the knuckles of his right hand and swallowed. He could already taste the error, like a mental tablet in his mouth. Forget it. He turned and walked home. Innocuously, a man walked past. Heil Hitler, he said. Heil Hitler, Hans replied.
So I noticed there's a comment in the chat from Tina about the irony of the fine line between the actions of a cowardly individual and a hero. And I think this passage also really illuminates that point, because so the question would be, when Hans says, forget it, to the Nazi Party member, right? And then he says, Heil Hitler, even though we know he doesn't support Hitler. What is he there? Is he cowardly? He, in some ways, still a hero? What's the relationship between courage and being careful, and between courage and being reckless, right? Because if he's reckless about his disapproval of Hitler, that's going to be a difficult situation. Is he going to be able to help people in the way he eventually does if he's reckless about his courage? And can you be courageous and be reckless?
How do you respond to those questions? I think it's interesting that the author says innocuously. A man walked past. He said, I don't know if that's ever an innocuous salute, but
well, I think actually in Nazi Germany, often it was like saying hello, right? It was just
it probably was.
Yeah. And that's why I think Renata's comment that he's not going to pick his battles about something small and petty. I mean, it is just almost a pleasantry in this context, even though it's hard for us to imagine that. And so he has to be careful about which battles he picks. So that makes me ask a question about the relationship between courage and judgment, right? Do we have to have, in order for courage to be effective, it would seem that we have to have a certain amount of judgment.
Let's see. Amelia writes, Hans also has to think about those beyond himself. He has responsibilities to his family. Pat Marshall writes, my students often ask if there's any percentage in being a dead hero or leaving living people behind to fight the battle you left behind. Good points.
Right, exactly. I mean, if your courage is such that it leaves you no longer able to fight the battle, how effective is it?
One of the things, too, that affects our judgment here is one of the points that the narrator, Death, makes, I think, a number of times, and that is we know how this story is going to end. We, here in the 21st century, we know that Hitler was this god-awful villain, and so that, I think, informs our view of the actions of all of the characters, that kind of dramatic irony.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to move us to the next passage.
Okay. Let me take a crack at that one.
Sure.
When a Jew shows up at your place of residence in the early hours of the morning, in the very birthplace of Nazism, you're likely to experience extreme levels of discomfort, anxiety, disbelief, paranoia. Each plays its part, and each leads to a sneaking suspicion that a less than heavily consequence awaits. The fear is shiny, ruthless in the eyes. The surprising point to make is that despite this iridescent fear glowing as it did in the dark, they somehow resisted the urge for hysteria.
So I can't resist before I read the questions to just make an observation about how wonderful this writing is. It just draws you right in, and it's so unusual and provocative. Okay, so is resisting the urge for hysteria a kind of courage? Exerting the kind of self-control that they exert here, is that a kind of courage?
Yeah, what would you say? Would that be a kind of courage? Casey writes, is it courageous to defy an innocuous greeting, or is it courageous to defy something bigger and not innocuous? So I think Casey is saying we have to pick our fights, pick and choose our fights. While people are typing in, I would also like to comment on the writing that wry irony there of death. When a Jew shows up at your door in the very birthplace of Nazism, you're likely to experience extreme levels of discomfort. Yeah, that's kind of an understatement. This narrator is really a distinctive narrative voice, and it almost makes you think Death's not such a bad guy. He's kind of funny at times. Mm-hmm. He's got a good sense of humor. Mm-hmm. I think Amelia writes to our question about hysteria. I think to fight against your base instincts shows courage. Fighting for ideals against yourself. I think also right, just exactly. the emotional strength not to become hysterical and panic. I think that's remarkable. That would be a form of courage, I should think, too.
Which then leads to this question: does courage always involve action? So in this case, courage would involve inaction, right? Resisting the urge for hysteria, keeping yourself from doing something. And sometimes does it take courage to do nothing, to remain silent, or to refuse to care what other people think? Is courage always an action, or can it involve inaction or simply thought?
Mm-hmm. How do we respond to that? Let's put those out there for our participants. And
so community, we haven't gotten courage is showing restraint sometimes. So right, I think, which again gets back to kind of the connection between courage and judgment.
Right. And does it always involve action? No need to read this one, just a teacher-to-teacher observation. Oh, so here I'm reading it. When we do close reading of passage, I think I would like to use this one, focusing on this rich literary device in this short passage. Well, thank you, Pat. We did ask for teacherly comments, and I know teachers are great thieves. They plunder from each other. That's absolutely wonderful.
And then the final question in this topic, this passage, is: can a community be courageous? We often think of courage as an individual virtue, but can a community as a whole be courageous? And we'll look at that question in a little more detail as we get further into the webinar. But it's really an interesting question to think about. What does it take for an entire community to be considered a courageous one?
It's a good question. Jana, last week we did a seminar on To Kill a Mockingbird, and these same questions would be applicable to that novel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, these two books go really well together, I've found.
Yeah. Well, Amelia writes, to bring in the passage we read to prep, I say absolutely that a community could be courageous. In the midst of chaos, it is courageous sometimes to remain silent. Yes.
Interesting.
That's true. Other comments we have coming across the chat.
Okay, well, I'll give it a minute before I move us.
Okay, on. Yeah. I hope that throughout in some of the other passages we can talk a little bit more about that narrative voice, that particularly the last line where Death says, "I am haunted by humans." We have time. I'd like to ask people what. Well, I think we have that in the slide, so I think I'd like to ask people what they think Death meant by that. Not going with the crowd is a form of courage, although one might argue that doing nothing might be as much a mark of paralyzing fear. Yes, that would depend on the circumstances. How would you respond to those?
Exactly. Well, so that's I think a good point, because the question about doing nothing, when you see action, it's easier to characterize it as courageous or not, right? Because we have some external evidence of what's going on. But when someone does nothing, we don't know always why. So in this case, the resisting the urge for hysteria and taking Max in, well, we can see that must be courageous, right? But it's the action, the taking Max in, that shows us that the resisting the urge for hysteria was courageous. But when it's just inaction, right? When we are just seeing inaction, how do we know whether it's courageous? I think about the civil rights movement and where people were being harassed and worse at lunch counters, etc., and sat there silently and did nothing. So we could see in that context, there's sort of some external evidence to show that this was a courageous act to do nothing. But it's a challenge. Okay. I'm going to move us on now to the...
Okay, she writes, indeed, and I love the comment we heard about the relative ease of assessing action as opposed to inaction. Hadn't thought of that. Okay, shall we move ahead? The nature of friendship.
Right, this is topic 2, so yes, if you would read this, Richard, that would be lovely.
Okay. In one of their basement sessions, Papa dispensed with the sandpaper. It was running out fast, and pulled out a brush. There were few luxuries in the Huberman household, but there was an oversupply of paint, and it became more than useful for Liesel's learning. Papa would say a word, and the girl would have to spell it aloud and then paint it on the wall as long as she got it right. After a month, the wall was recoated, a fresh cement page. You stink, Mama would say to Hans, like cigarettes and kerosene. Sitting in the water, she imagined the smell of it, mapped out on her papa's clothes. More than anything, it was the smell of friendship, and she could find it on herself, too. Liesel loved that smell. She would sniff her arm and smile as the water cooled around her.
Oh, just another wonderful passage. So what does this mean? What does Liesel mean when she imagines the smell of friendship, feel to friendship? When we first become close to someone else, start to have the recognition in a relationship that we are becoming friends, is there a particular sort of what philosophers call phenomenological, like a feeling that we have that the experience is able to be described as in that way? Is there some feelings that friendship can invoke that includes sensual things like the smell of friendship? What does she mean by that?
Mm-hmm.
And
it's related on that one.
What makes friendship pleasurable? What is it that we find gives us pleasure about friendship? And especially for all of our students, I mean, they're at the ages where friendship is a central, maybe the central learning experience of their lives at this point in school. Making friends, figuring out who are their real friends, all of these kinds of things. So what is it that's so pleasurable? How does friendship feel? Does it feel? And what does that mean?
Okay. I think here too, the smell is notoriously powerful in conjuring up memories, and I think some of that might be at work here. I imagine it's like when you're in love, just a different type of love. We're social beings, connections are important. Consider the impact that touch has on the development of children. Good. Very good insight, Amelia.
Right.
So we have some more people typing in. I think too that go ahead.
Well, that leads me to the last question for this passage, which is, how do we recognize friendship? I mean, Liesel knows that there's friendship there in her relationship, the relationship she's starting to develop with Hans. What is it that she recognizes? And what
does she recognize? Yeah. Also, of course, friendship is bound up with the theme of her relationship with Rudy. I mean, that's a connection that is exclusive to true friends.
Oh, I love that. The smell of being understood by others. So what is that? I mean, is that then kind of their smell? I mean, is it something that's kind of like someone else said, like being in love? It's just, it reminds us of that person and gives us the feeling of being understood and appreciated.
Yeah, Papa's perfume was cigarettes and kerosene. Tina writes, the sense of smell is so powerful. I love that they were able to put into words something that most individuals are only able to feel. Similar to the way that the smell of fresh baked cookies triggers the individual to think of their grandmother and makes them feel warm, safe, loved. The smell of cigarettes and kerosene provides her with that sense of companionship. Well stated.
Exactly. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
What do we make of the fact that they're using the wall as a blackboard? She has to paint her words on a cement wall. Any do we see any significance in that? Words as foundational or something like that? The language is such an important theme
Oh
in this.
yeah. I mean, I think there's lots of things that you can say about the wall and what it represents. And I hadn't actually thought about what Lynn Moore just said, that her
Hmm.
friendships are all with boys and men after the loss of her brother.
Hmm.
That I hadn't quite made that connection, but right. And so then it leads me to think about whether what we seek in our friends are to fill some places that aren't being filled, maybe by our families or in other places.
Hmm.
And
Well,
that's why
there's
we're attracted to certain people.
right. There's also Ilsa Herman, her friendship with Ilsa Herman, which in the end proves to be absolutely critical to her survival.
Right. But which is a very mixed friendship, right?
It
That friendship.
is. It
Yeah.
is very complex. Yeah, and you
Yeah.
wonder about Ilsa. Okay, but you do wonder about Ilsa Herman's motivations. I mean, I think she was one of the saddest characters. You had this feeling that that library was closed up and hidden because she knows what would happen if the Nazis ever found out about it. And
She's a
Liesel
broken
was her.
person.
Yeah, she's a broken person, and Liesel was her connection to another human being, and over something vital like words. Obviously, they were important to Ilsa.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's another passage. This is a letter that Liesel writes to her.
Okay, dear Mrs. Herman, as you can see, I have been in your library again, and I have ruined one of your books. I was just so angry and afraid that I wanted to kill the words. I have stolen from you, and now I've wrecked your property. I'm sorry. To punish myself, I think I will stop coming here. Or is it punishment at all? I love this place and hate it, because it is full of words. You have been a friend to me, even though I hurt you, even though I have been insufferable, a word I looked up in your dictionary, and I think I will leave you alone now. I'm sorry for everything. Thank you again, Liesel Memminger.
So Liesel doesn't think of herself as a friend to Mrs. Herman. She knows that she hasn't really treated her like a friend. But she sees now that Mrs. Herman has been a friend to her. So it kind of raises this question, does a friendship have to be reciprocal to someone, even if that person doesn't consider me a friend?
Okay? How would you respond to that? Does friendship have to be mutual? Can I be a friend to someone even if that person doesn't consider me a friend? I would say probably so. Uh, might be hard for the other person. That's pretty mature. Okay. I wish we did hear more from Ilsa Herman. She was a fascinating character.
Mm-hmm.
There's always guilt. The person who is not holding up their end of the bargain always feels the strain. More comments.
Yeah, and right. I mean, does friendship have to, do both people have to give? Maybe not simultaneously. I mean, there's always times in a friendship where one person's giving more, whatever the situation, but do both people have to give at some point in order for it to be a friendship? Or, so Pat Marshall says sometimes a one-way friendship is the most enduring. It's perfect in its utter predictability. Well, yeah, like it would be predictable, but would it be a friendship?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
You can treat
I
a
guess it
person.
could be.
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead, sorry. Well, I'm
I was
wondering,
just.
would it be a friendship? Because I think about, so for example, I mean, I guess you could have a friendship. in some ways, we might think of certain characters in books who have been really important to us as our friends. We might talk about them in that way, even. Well, that's obviously not a mutual experience, but it is in some ways the most enduring, right? It's this one-way friendship because you have a lot of control over it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Another famously ambiguous, perhaps, friendship, Huck and Jim on the raft. Jim certainly sees him as a son. How does Huck relate to Jim? It takes him a little while to figure that one out.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another comment. Friendships are hard because you would hope there is mutual respect for each other. If it is one-sided, then what's the point?
Right. I mean, I know with our children, right, we'll say to them, well, is that person really being a friend to you, right? We'll think about, I mean, is this a good relationship for you? Or is this friendship really one where both sides are showing respect, as Marina says?
Mm-hmm.
So what do we owe to our friends? Can I be a friend to someone even if they don't show respect to me, even if they hurt me? In this case, is Mrs. Herman, is she a friend to Liesl, even though Liesl hurts her and doesn't always show respect to her?
We have some folks typing in, but one of the things that we have to keep in mind about the friendship between Mrs. Herman and Liesl is the difference in age. I mean, clearly, I think Mrs. Herman sees her as something of a daughter. This is a child, and when Liesl goes berserk and really chews her out, Mrs. Herman's response, she's devastated, she's hurt, the words injure her, but she doesn't respond angrily. You know, she seems to take it, and she seems to understand that this is a child under great stress. Renetta writes, that sounds desperate to be friends with someone who doesn't respect or care about you. Some more responses
and
coming in.
I think Mrs. Herman is desperate. I mean, she is desperately alone, desperately sad. And can you be friends with someone who doesn't respect or care about you?
Mm-hmm.
Good. Linda just says, is there a difference between a friendship and simply a kindness? Right. I mean, does a friendship imply some kind of mutuality?
Uh-huh.
At some point.
But clearly Mrs. Herman gets something out of the friendship, because when she comes to, can't remember, when she comes to, I think it's Liesl's house, or when she picks Liesl up, I think it's when she comes to Liesl's house at some point, she does smile. The friendship causes her to smile, and that was a movement. That was an emotional thawing out for her. So her relationship with Liesl does do something for her. Amelia writes, I think we have also considered that sometimes a friendship trades off. I'm friends with some previous students who might not have liked me when I taught them.
Right. And right, exactly. And friendship can be equal at some point and unequal at other points, or we can be friends with someone with whom we were not friends when we were in a sort of a different stance with each other than we are now. And I think the other thing Mrs. Herman gets from Liesl is she is made happy to see someone else who loves words. That's sort of a sense of commonality and affirmation that she gets from watching Liesl. That's important to her.
Right, and she's something of a mentor too. I mean, the book she leaves for her on the windowsill to steal is, after all, a thesaurus. You know, she knows that that book is really going to help that child with her words. It was a very deliberate and wise choice.
Mm-hmm.
And Renata writes, he has to pick battles, and it's not worth being small and petty. Let's see, the scrolling got away from me here. Friendships can evolve, as those friendships with Amelia and her students did. Clearly, they came to see, they grew up and became wise, realized that she was doing something for them. The relationship evolves into a friendship.
Right.
Now,
we can all think of relationships we had which didn't seem at all like friendships, which were maybe antagonistic even, and then did eventually evolve into friendships. Okay, I'm going to move us to the next.
Okay, well, remember how the friendship between Liesl and Rudy starts. He throws a snowball at her and hits her in the face. Not an auspicious beginning.
So this is a quote that I thought might be useful in discussing this topic while you're reading The Book Thief with your students, because it also raises the question about our obligations to our friends in a very straightforward way. So the quote is, "If I had to choose," and this is from E.M. Foster, "if I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my." So that seems to imply that our obligations to our friends are greater than our obligations to the larger, more general community or nation in which we live. Is that right? I mean, we think of having special obligations to our friends as opposed to other individuals with whom we have no relationship or we don't know. But do we have greater obligations to our friends than to the larger community in which we live? And in what case would E.M. Foster be correct about what he says?
Now, that is a question that could probably stimulate an awful lot of discussion in class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I had this conversation recently with some middle school students, and we were talking about what do you do? Because the question was, should you always agree with your friends? And some of the students at first said, yes, you should always agree with your friends. And then we talked about, well, so what if your friends were engaging in hate speech, say, or were saying things about your family, or were saying things about other people that you found really distasteful? Should you always agree with them? And so, that led them to say, well, okay, maybe not in those cases. But what do we do when we're faced with, for example, as students are often faced with a situation where your friend forgets to study or forgets to do her homework and asks if she can copy your worksheet and is afraid that she'll get a terrible grade otherwise? In that case, what's the right thing to do? Is the right thing to do to say, okay, just this one time, I know you don't usually forget to do your homework? Or is the right thing to say, well, I really can't do that. That's not really something you should be asking me to do because it could get me in trouble. What's the right thing to do there?
Pat Marshall has a good point. Country is fairly nebulous, remote concept. Friend is much more immediate. Friend is often easier to betray because it is more comprehensible.
So say more about that, Pat. What does it mean when you say a friend's easier to betray because it's more comprehensible? Meaning a friend is easy, it's an easier concept to understand, and so we can, betray our friend. We can tell the school that our friend is cheating on an exam or something because that's a more straightforward question than what it might mean to betray our country.
Amelia writes, I think we have differing levels of obligation. There are some friendships which are reciprocal, like work friends. There are others where you do anything for them, even if you haven't seen each other in a while, like childhood friends.
Mm-hmm. So there's different...
Yeah, that is really... Yes, go ahead.
There's different kinds of friends, then that would seem to conclude. I asked the question earlier and we didn't get to it, are there some features that are common to all friendships? And I guess another way of thinking about that question is, are there different kinds of friendships? I mean, do we have different kinds of friendships with our neighbors versus our childhood friends versus our work colleagues? And what does that mean?
Well, Tina writes, I can only imagine what my answer to that question would have been in middle school. Much like friendships evolve, the individual also evolves, requiring the growth of friendship. And Pat has elaborated on her comment, we can betray a friend because we can repair that betrayal in many cases. Betraying a country, a la Snowden, is often irreparable. And Lynn writes, I disagree. In today's political climate, people in the USA are less connected to the greater community. Their ties are more personal and immediate. And Susan writes, I think there might be an interesting aspect of anonymity to explore with students. Good point. Right. With the interaction of social media today, some students may do something if no one else will know who they are. Jana, how does the social media must figure in at some extent with
Well,
your
I was just going
discussion
to
with
say, social
students?
media also raises a whole question about what constitutes a friendship. Can you be friends with someone you've never met or never
Hmm.
talked to other than through interacting on Twitter, say? Is that a friendship, and what kind? What is that? As we've said, there's maybe different kinds of friendship. So, what kind of a friendship is that, and do we have a different kind of obligation to that friend than to our friends that we see at work every day? And when we can be anonymous, that allows us to do things maybe to our friends and they'll never know it. So it's very different. If you're betraying a friend and your friend knows they're betraying them, that's one thing. If you're able to betray your friend and your friend has no idea it was you, that's a whole nother layer of complexity.
Hmm. And social media redefines the whole notion of community as well.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think Forster's comment, that's one of these, large sweeping statements.
Mm-hmm.
Betraying one's Snowden, you could say he did or did not betray his country, depending upon your opinion on that matter. But um, betraying one's country sounds really large. It sounds like you're a spy or you're going to do great damage to the community. That's a that's quite a leap. Whereas I think most of us, as some of our participants have said here, for us, it's a much smaller thing.
Well, I think one nice example, for example, would be the Friends of the Boston Marathon bombers,
Yeah.
right? I
Hmm.
mean, what in that situation, what were their obligations to this younger brother? Should they have turned him in? Should they have not turned him in? What's the right thing to do in that situation? I mean, I think many of us would assume it would be to turn him in, but so is that betraying your friendship? And in that case, is it ethically justified to betray your friend?
Hmm. Yeah, you got at what I was groping toward there just a minute ago. Uh, that's a much better example than what I was trying to than any I could have reached at that moment. Lynn Moore writes they were convicted, the friends of the Tsarnaev brothers.
Right. Yep. Yeah. So legally, clearly, they were obligated, right? But
Hmm.
what's legally obligated and what's ethically obligated might not always be the same thing. Often aren't the same thing.
Hmm.
Okay, I'm going to move us.
Yeah, and that's where the
Go ahead.
okay, but that example, it's a perfect example. That is where the Forster quote really begins to
Mm-hmm.
hit some headwinds.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
If you interpret country in a certain way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Even your community say. Um, yeah, and I think Pat's question is exactly right. To what do we ultimately owe allegiance? To ourselves, to our friends, to our communities, nations, to our deity? I mean, and in what situations do the answers to those questions differ depending on the circumstances? Is it in some cases it's to ourselves, in some cases it's to our friends, in some cases it's to our deity? Okay, I'm going to move us to the next topic because we're a little bit behind time. Uh, and this topic is about our moral obligations to our community. So, what obligations do we have beyond the individual relationships we have in our lives? And Richard, would you read the passage?
Sure. After lodging his form at the Nazi headquarters on Munich Street, he witnessed four men throw several bricks into a clothing store named Kleinman's. It was one of the few Jewish shops that were still in operation in Molching. Inside, a small man was stuttering about, crushing the broken glass beneath his feet as he cleaned up. A star the color of mustard was smeared to the door. In sloppy lettering, the words Jewish filth were spilling over at the edges. The movement inside tapered from hurried to morose, then stopped altogether. Hans moved closer, stuck his head inside. Do you need some help?
So, why did Hans here offer to help Mr. Kleinman? It was a risk. for him to do this, for him to walk in and help clean up, to him to show himself as a sympathizer of this Jewish man? Why does he do it? And should he do it? Is he morally obligated when he's walking by and sees what's going on to help? I mean, we might say it was a really nice thing to do. Would we say he was obligated to do it?
Okay. Is he obligated, or is he simply being nice? How would we respond to that?
And that's something that's really helpful to help your students get clear about, because I find that that's often a area of confusion for students. They say things like, well, yeah, it's the right thing to do because it's nice to help people. And so we'll say, well, okay, let's take that apart. So we might say, oh, someone's being really nice to bring in. What cases would they be obligated to do something? If they see someone throwing a brick through their neighbor's window, are they obligated in that case to get help, to call the police, or would it just be the nice thing to do? Those kinds of things. And it's complicated.
Pat Marshall writes, Hans must feel some sort of obligation because being nice generally doesn't include putting one's life at risk. And of course, he is putting his life at risk in that situation.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, yes, he does feel some kind of, at least, propulsion to help him. And yes.
Maybe some people relieve some guilt in another way by helping someone. I think the scene speaks to the Not in Our Town article that we read, that mix of community and individual responsibility. His moral compass prompts him to help, and Hans does not think Jewish, but Hans sees his helping as an obligation.
Oh, interesting. Right. So I think that's right. I mean, Hans looks at people as people. And so he sees this man he's known the clothing store forever, and he just wants to help. And he doesn't really think to himself, I want to help because this person's Jewish or because this is a Jewish problem. He just thinks, I'm going to help clean up because that's the kind of person he is, perhaps. So maybe it's a question less about what he's obligated to do in some ways and more about a question about what kind of character he has. So, and this relates to what Lynn just writes. She says, if Hans does not suffer himself, would he have helped? There's a discussion about the lack of empathy in affluent communities where people don't need to depend on others, right? So if we don't know what it's like to need help, are we less likely to want to help others or to understand how important it is to help other people?
And Linda writes, perhaps to remind himself of his humanness.
Well, that's a really interesting thing to say. So is it just part of being a human being to reach out to other people? Someone said earlier in the chat that connection to other people is part of being a person, and maybe that's one of the things that Hans's action was trying to combat, the dehumanization of groups of people that was going on in Nazi Germany, by reminding himself that reaching out to someone else is just what you do if you're a human being. So what might be the reasons that many people didn't do this, right? Because most people during the Holocaust did not reach out to help Jews and others. And is everyone who didn't act, who didn't help, were they indifferent? Might there be other reasons that they didn't act besides people who agreed with the Nazis? People who just didn't act, were they afraid? Were they, I don't know. What are some of the reasons that people who don't act in the face of injustice or oppression, besides hatred?
Okay. What are some of the other reasons people don't act in situations like this? Takers on that question? We have several people typing in. Let's see what they have to add here. Yeah, I think obviously fear is an enormous motivator. You fear, cowardice, indifference, so many possible reasons. So then the fear question is go ahead.
Well, then you wonder, so if if your motivations are fear, cowardice, indifference, self-preservation, do we stop feeling human? I mean, to repeat Linda's point, if we turn away, does that make us stop feeling human? And so, yeah, for the aftermath in Ferguson is a perfect example of how to bring this together. What's going on in people's lives? If we stay apart from it, if we that's not our problem, I don't want to be involved in that, I'm scared of being involved in that, do we stop feeling part of the human community at some point?
Amelia writes, they pass the buck. A lot of people won't act because they think someone else will. Someone else should. That's why CPR training tells you to assign the responsibility to someone.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Although I wonder, in this case, often, so many of the people who did, for example, shelter Jews and hide Jews and others in their homes, when interviewed after the war, many of them said things like, they didn't think to themselves, it's my responsibility to do this. They just were kind of like Hans at the door here. They had an opportunity to help, and they just did. They often say, I didn't even think about it. I was just able to help, and so I did.
But you do see in the novel, they do begin to think about it when Max gets sick. What do we do with the corpse of a dead Jew? They began to, they didn't, that is about as close as they come to hysteria, I think, if I can remember correctly. They do begin to think about it. Amelia writes, I think we have differing levels of obligation. There are some friendships which are, that's again, once the, sorry, the chat got beyond me. Okay, that was not a new comment. I'm sorry, folks.
So this gets us to...
Y'all are sending the chat in too quickly.
Yeah, no. This gets us to think about, and you can help your students think about kind of the small moral choices we make in our everyday lives that leads us to becoming either resistors or bystanders. Hans does these small things like asking if someone needs help, and it leads him in part to become the kind of person who then takes Max in. And so I often end up, when I do this particular passage and this conversation with kids, to talking about bullying in the hallways and the choices you make to speak up, not to speak up, to help someone, not to help someone, and what the ultimate ramifications might be of those what seem at the time as kind of small choices, but end up in some ways shaping who you become.
That's true. Let's see, I think we might want to move ahead.
Yes, we do. Okay, do you want to read this one?
Somewhere near Munich, a German Jew was making his way through the darkness. An arrangement had been made to meet Hans Huberman in 4 days, that is, if he wasn't taken away. It was at a place far down the Amper, where a broken bridge leaned among the river and trees. He would make it there, but he would not stay longer than a few minutes. The only thing to be found there when Papa arrived 4 days later was a note under a rock at the base of the tree. It was addressed to nobody and contained only one sentence. The last words of Max Vandenberg, "You have done enough."
So, why did Max leave? Why did he not come back to the Hubermans? Had Hans done enough? And what would be enough in this kind of situation? If Hans has done enough, what makes it enough?
Good questions. What do we have coming in the chat? I know Max's situation was one of the most gripping that I've seen in fiction lately. It was like you just saw it. You didn't see how this was going to end well for anybody. Max couldn't escape. He couldn't go out, and you knew that the longer he was there, the Hubermans were going to get caught. It was just kind of I could feel I could share his claustrophobia in reading
Mhm.
about his time down there in the basement.
Right,
Well done.
right, right. So was it enough? I mean, Hans, they put themselves in great danger to help Max. Is
Okay,
this, go
Max's
ahead.
actions speak back to our discussion about friendship. Can he repay them all for they've done by continuing to be a burden for them, even if they didn't see him as a burden?
Right. And for Max, what's it like to feel like a burden? Right. I mean, and this does get back to this discussion about friendship because here you're feeling like it can't be reciprocal. Max is endangering them. His presence is endangering them. He can't give anything back really at this point to them other than, their awareness that they're helping and the way they feel about helping. But it's obviously a huge risk situation for them. So for him, maybe being in that situation is no longer tenable. That having someone give up what they're giving up and take the risk they're taking to help him is he can no longer feel good or feel okay about putting them in that situation. So
Mm-hmm.
when we put ourselves in danger to help others, it's interesting to think, it's easy to think about the cost to ourselves, but we might also think about the cost to the person we're helping. What is it like to be helped in such a way that you're putting the other person at great risk and you really can't give them anything back till at some time in the future, if that time ever comes. Yeah, the debt becomes
So,
too high a price to bear. Exactly. I think maybe that's what's happening for Max here. Because of course what happens for Max after this is not very good, right? He doesn't end up in a good circumstance at all. But maybe for him, he couldn't be there, be sheltered by them anymore, and be able to live with himself.
mhm.
Okay, I'm going to move us to the next slide, which is the not in my town. And so I hope everybody was able to read this. Basically, just to give a very brief description of this, and this is a really nice, pretty short piece. There's also a nice little film about it that you can find online to show to your students if you're having the conversation about kind of obligations to the community. Because this is a situation where in the early 1990s, there was a series of hate crimes in Billings, Montana, including one where a brick was thrown through a little Jewish boy's window. Fortunately, he wasn't in his bedroom at that time. The brick had been thrown because there was a menorah in the window. And in response, the town put in the newspaper published in the newspaper day after day a graphic of a menorah that people could cut out and put in their windows. And by the end of it, thousands, and this is a town of, I don't know, it's like maybe 80,000 people, thousands of people had put up menorahs in the windows. And many of them, when interviewed, said they were scared to do so at first, but nevertheless did. And it shut down the hate crimes, at least at that point in that place. So do you want to? This is just a short passage piece, and would you mind reading it, Richard?
Sure. I mean, what have we done so far? Come up with a plan, make a few phone calls, put up menorahs. That's all we did. Pretty simple stuff, actually. But you have to build the sentiment to forge the real feeling that goes deep. We did something right here, and we will do it again if we have to. If we don't, there are people who would break every window in Billings, and we will look out those windows and see ourselves.
So there's a nice quote that I like to use with this. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. This is by philosopher Edmund Burke. And how does it relate to what the people in Billings did? Nothing. They would have allowed the hate crimes to continue. The Billings sheriff in the film says these hate groups have learned through experience that if a community doesn't respond, the community accepts. Silence is acceptance to them. So if no one had done anything in Billings, the hate groups would have read that as the community was accepting these acts of violence. So does that mean then we're morally obligated to act? when acts like the violence in Billings happens? Why or why not?
Okay, good questions. Put them out there and see what our participants say. We're getting some comments here coming through. Let's see, it's not there yet. I would think the people in Billings really did it was a brilliant strategy. It's almost kind of what's a sort of a form of public shaming in some ways, and I don't want to dismiss what they did, but they did make it a little easy to do that, and that's a brilliant way to galvanize a community.
Although it's interesting. I mean, I think it became easy once the first 100 were up in people's windows. But the first, 5, 10, 25 people who put those up, that took some courage, right? Because they didn't know, they were making themselves targets, and they knew they were. And at that point, there weren't, targets all over the neighborhood. There were just a few that first night or second night or third night. But people did it anyway. And it's sort of this, if no one had started it, it never would have grown. So someone had to be among the first group. And those people, despite their fear, despite knowing they were putting themselves and their families at risk, got going. And yeah, so Amelia says once the movement got started, it was easier to participate. It's ironic that hate speech works the same way. That's interesting, right? Yeah, so it works the same both ways, both sort of fighting hate. It's easier once other people are doing it, and getting involved in being part of a hate group also is easier the more people are engaged in it, just like what we saw in Nazi Germany and what we've seen all over the world ever since at various points.
Yeah, this reminds me of the Black Lives Matter movement. That's people are engaging in right now to protest the killings at Ferguson and elsewhere. Hey, Tina writes, the symbolism of the Nora reminds me of how Americans began displaying the flag after 9/11.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the statement we could make without speech by putting things up in our windows or on our cars. We can try make statements about what we think about the world or what we believe in all kinds of ways without ever saying anything.
Some more comments coming in. Did this fill us in on the rest of what happened to Billings? Does this put an end to that particular
it did
spate of
vandalism? Basically, the hate groups at that point, that particular spate of violence stopped. All right, I'm going to move us on because we are definitely short of time, and I want to get to this last topic, the beauty and ugliness of life, which is a theme that runs throughout the book. And the couple of passages I've chosen are from toward the end of the book and the end of the book. Would you mind reading this one?
It's probably fair to say that in all the years of Hitler's reign, no person was able to serve the Führer as loyally as me. A human doesn't have a heart like mine. The human heart is a line, whereas my own is a circle, and I have the endless ability to be in the right place at the right time. The consequence of this is that I'm always finding humans at their best and worst. I see their ugly and their beauty. And I wonder how the same thing can be both. Still, they have one thing I envy. Humans, if nothing else, have the good sense to die.
So this is such a rich passage philosophically. Here are some of the questions that I came up with, but I think there are many more, and it would be interesting to see what questions your students would come up with after reading this passage. So one is, what does it mean to have a heart like a line or a circle? Is Death talking about the fact that his heart continues on because he's immortal while ours ends? Or is there some other way we can think about having a heart, not a life or a body, but a heart, like a line or a circle? And why does death envy our ability to die? Does our mortality limit what we can understand. I mean, death says he has the endless ability to be in the right place at the right time, unlike us. So our mortality clearly limits us in that we only live in one time period. Does it limit us in other ways? And then, are humans both beautiful and ugly? Are each of the characters in the book both beautiful and ugly? Can you be both? Is everyone both? What does it mean to be beautiful? What does it mean to be ugly? Can you have one without the other?
Really profound questions here late in our seminar. What do our participants have to say there? I think when I read that, I took the heart as a line as being both a symbol of finiteness, but also a symbol of progress. I mean, we can move from one point to another. We can make moral progress, but death, having heart as a circle, cannot. He is trapped in well, death is amoral here, but he is trapped in that amorality. He never evolves. He never progresses. Amelia writes, I think the circular heart speaks to the supposed impartiality of death. It comes to all. It doesn't stop because you're rich or poor. He is also omniscient. He literally sees all angles. Yeah.
So interesting, right? So omniscient and impartial and fair and objective, but also unable to change. Right? So humans die, but we also progress, as you say.
Right.
And death doesn't.
And Susan writes, I like the idea of appreciating beauty without ugliness. If there were no standard of measurement, beauty or kindness would not stand out. And Pat Marshall writes, but a line also implies infinity and the inability to ever come back, the road not taken, so to speak.
Yeah, which raises some interesting questions about what time is like if you're immortal versus what time is like for us, where we don't come back to earlier points on the line.
We have some more comments coming in. Again, this narrator.
Yeah,
yes, go ahead.
So Susan said, I like the idea of appreciating beauty without ugliness. Yeah, so would you be able to recognize beauty without ugliness? Would you be able to recognize kindness without cruelty, or happiness without sadness? Do we need these opposites in a sense in order to understand what they are, or to be able to recognize them?
We have another comment coming in, but again, the narrative voice here is just amazing.
Yeah.
You almost you become familiar with death. you almost like the guy after a while.
Well, yeah. I mean, death here is not. He doesn't relish his job. It is his job.
Yeah, and he's got a sense of humor about himself too. In that one passage where he talks about what he looks like, and he says, "No, I really don't have a skull head, and I don't wear a black robe unless it's cold."
Yep, and he really has. I mean, he does have a heart. Maybe it's not like ours, but he does have one, right? Yeah. His feelings for Liesel make that clear. Okay, let's go to the final passage. I'll read this one.
Okay, go right ahead.
I wanted to tell the book thief many things about beauty and brutality, but what could I tell her about those things that she didn't already know? I wanted to explain that I am constantly overestimating and underestimating the human race, that rarely do I ever simply estimate it. I wanted to ask her how the same thing could be so ugly and so glorious, and its words and stories so damning and brilliant. None of those things, however, came out of my mouth. All I wanted to do was to turn to Liesel Meminger and tell her the only truth I truly know. I said it to the book thief, and I say it now. The last note from your narrator. I am haunted by humans. So what does that mean? Why is death haunted by humans? Is it our capacity to make choices, and the choices we make? Is it some of the things we talked about in the previous passage about our ability to move forward but not to come back to any point that we've been. Was Liesel's life beautiful despite the brutality that surrounded her? Can suffering be beautiful?
And Linda, and going back to our questions about beauty and ugliness, Linda writes, reminds me of Anne Bradstreet's quote that had there been no winter, then spring would not be so pleasant. Likewise, to taste of adversity means prosperity is also welcome. Amelia writes, I hate the idea that Death thinks Liesel understands beauty and brutality as well as he does. And Amelia writes, that's the last passage I assume she's talking about there. That's heartbreaking. What do we think about that?
Well, it's interesting to think about, right? So Death has seen all of it. He has seen all of the various manifestations of the Holocaust and this time, as well as previous times, that have happened throughout history where there has been plenty of brutality and beauty. But yet he thinks the book thief already knows all those things. There's nothing he can tell her, right? Yeah, like Amelia says, he's seen all evil and all good, and he thinks that she understands. So can we understand without having seen all of it from some very specific experiences what beauty and brutality are in the way that Death thinks Liesel does?
Let's see. That Marshall is typing in. Neil Gaiman says in The Nice and Accurate Prophecies of Agnes Nutter, which hell wasn't a major reservoir of evil any more than heaven was a fountain of goodness. They were just sides in the great cosmic chess game, where you found the real McCoy, the real Grace, and the real heart-stopping evil was right inside the human mind. I tend to agree. Well, Death here really does not understand the human race. He says he never gets it right. He either overestimates or underestimates. He never estimates it properly, and he's baffled. He doesn't know how human beings can be so ugly and so glorious, how their stories can be so damning and so brilliant. And I think that uncertainty is what haunts him. And Death does not have free will. Good point. It goes back to that sort of circular notion of his heart. He never progresses. He never really understands.
Well, and exactly. And so part of the reason perhaps that he's haunted by humans is he can't understand how to make choices. Like Amelia says, he can't understand our choices because he has none.
Now let me pose a question here. When he says, I am haunted by humans, is he being ironic? I mean, humans are haunted by death, right? And now he's saying, hey, I'm haunted by humans. Is there that little sneaky, ironic humor sneaking in there?
No,
because he's done that.
I don't
he's done that throughout.
I mean, I read it as the whole book is him being haunted by Liesel. Humans in general. And I think it is by this sense of this utter goodness that shows itself in some of the actions of some of the characters. And then this, as the quote that Pat put down here, that heart-stopping evil, and that those two things can exist side by side, sometimes in the same person. How do you then estimate accurately this group of beings? And then Amelia says, of course he's haunted by them. He has to take them all. He's literally watching The Walking Dead. There's a great picture book, by the way, called Duck, Death, and the Tulip. It's on our, there's a little lesson about it on our website if you want to take a look. And I use picture books all the time with my undergraduates and with high school students as well as younger kids. But it's a great story about death. Death is also in this book, and a duck who is dying and their relationship. And one of the things that comes out in the book is Duck says, you know, why are you here? And Death says, I'm always here. And it's a really interesting book to kind of raise some of these questions about our relationship with death and how we understand death and the role of death in our lives.
Okay, we've got some other comments coming in. From one perspective, Death is a truly tragic figure in this novel. Yeah. His lack of understanding, his bafflement,
He's
and he doesn't seem.
he's so
Go ahead.
alone. He's completely
Yeah,
alone.
yeah, and he doesn't take any relish in his work. I mean, he's not. He doesn't seem, to be ravenous the way death is often portrayed. He's doing this. He's getting tired of it, I think, actually, and that goes back to the notion of his circular heart. He's suggesting he wishes he could break out of this. It's an endless round for him. He sees himself as a victim.
Yeah, which one of
As
us
Linda
would want
writes.
his job? None of us, right?
Yeah. So we have the good sense to die, as he says.
Right.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our seminar. Let me ask if there are any final questions or comments before we wrap things up. Let's take a minute here to see if we have anything coming through the chat. Jana, while we're waiting, let me thank you. It is an understatement to say that you've given us a lot to think about. You laid some really large questions on us tonight. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. I really enjoyed it. Thanks to everyone for participating.
And I want to thank our participants. You responded with some really insightful comments to those large questions. And as Pat says here, thank you for or Amelia writes, thank you for the awesome prompts. I hope you'll be able to take these questions back into your classes and use this approach to provoke the same kind of discussion with your students that we had here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please check americainclass.org for our upcoming webinars. On March 26th, we'll be looking at Escape from Harlem, the New Negro Movement in Global Perspective. We're sponsoring that with primary source from Boston, Massachusetts. Don't forget to send us your evaluations. They're very important to us. We pay attention to them and try to upgrade and improve our seminars based on what you tell us. Again, Jana, thank you very much. Wonderful seminar. We really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Have a great evening, everyone.
And yes, let me echo that. Ladies and gentlemen, have a great evening, and please join us again. Thank you, and good night.